Hello and welcome. Today I am sharing 10 books that I would recommend to anyone to read. Something to note as I was coming up with this list, there are definitely books on here that you probably have heard of, but I did try very hard to come up with books that maybe aren't the most common or often recommended. I know that a lot of you watch a lot of BookTube and read Substacks and learn a lot, and so you know a lot about books. I recognize that. And so my goal here is to kind of think about, well, it might be a book that you've heard of, but you haven't had somebody say, I think this is worth being in a list of 10 books that I would feel comfortable recommending to anyone. So that was kind of the vision that I had when I was choosing these books. So let's get started. So the first category is technically middle grade, but I will say I think that these are books that can be enjoyed by anyone at any age. So the first one is one that I love to recommend, and that is Summer of the Monkeys by Wilson Rawls. Wilson Rawls wrote Where the Red Fern Grows, which is a rip your heart out and stomp on it kind of a book. You are most likely going to end that sobbing. But Summer of the Monkeys is not like that. I did cry, but it was from the first time tears of laughter, and the second time just at the end, there's just this beautiful tears of joy experience. It's just really lovely. It is a summer story of a boy who, the town that he's in, monkeys have escaped from the circus, and he has to round them up in order to get a reward. His grandfather is superfluously involved. Basically, J. Barry Lee's kind of experiences of going down into the swamps to look for these monkeys. It is laugh out loud funny. It is sweet. He has a sister who has a physical disability. And I love the representation in this. And this is just a top recommendation for me every year. So like I always like to say, if you haven't read this yet, then what are you waiting for? Next, this big chunker. It's actually my daughter's version. Mine is an old falling apart version, so I asked her if I could borrow hers. This is actually the trilogy, but the book I wanted to recommend is My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George. Jean Craighead George writes the most beautiful nature writing of almost any author out there. So that's one of the things I love the most about it is her nature writing. I also love the independence and autonomy and creativity, the wild and free childhood that we are all kind of reminiscing about, but don't necessarily see that much anymore, and that is in My Side of the Mountain. We've got Sam Gribley, who leaves the city for the country. He runs away, and he ends up with a peregrine falcon, frightful, and he has to survive. So My Side of the Mountain, this is a great time of year to read this book, as well as picking it up when you are kind of looking for this solitary return back to nature experience. Next, we are going to move into what I would call women's lit. The first one is The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery. I remember a few years ago, maybe it was a decade ago, a dear friend of mine asked me to read this. I wasn't familiar with L.M. Montgomery's adult works. I started to read it and I thought, why in the world would she have recommended me to read this heartbreaking book? And needless to say, I got through it and absolutely loved it. This also is a lot of beautiful nature prose. L.M. Montgomery just does such a fantastic job in this. You can see all the tabs. Most of those are probably nature quotes. She talks about each of the seasons. I've actually written them down in a commonplace book. I really do love this book with my whole heart. And if you haven't read it, then I beseech you to open it up and give it a chance. Don't quit at the beginning, because I definitely, as I was starting it, I thought, I don't really like Valency's family. The Sterling family is really terrible. And I also don't like what Valency is having to go through. But we progress through this. We trust L.M. Montgomery, and she does not lead us wrong. This focuses on a spinster who really does have a terrible family. And she gets some news that makes her decide that she is going to start living her life differently, not necessarily for her family, but for herself. She makes a whole bunch of decisions and choices that her family are just appalled at, but she really feels like are right. And we just go along with Valency in her growing up, even though she already is in her late 20s by the time we start this. And then after the Blue Castle, I thought long and hard about what would I put next to the Blue Castle in a category, right? That's got to be, something that can withstand that pressure. And so I chose Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. I find this story to be pretty funny. It is this odd juxtaposition of somebody who's like really down on their luck. They're sort of like, it's like nothing can go right. And then for 24 hours, she ends up getting an employment agency that sends her to be a night singer's assistant. And it is just full of hijinks and miscommunications and just ridiculousness. Also, there is a movie that I think does it pretty good justice, but really phenomenal book with some just funny situations. And I think it's pretty uplifting and leaves you with hope. Next, I have mysteries. So the first one that I'm going to recommend is T.E. Kinsey's A Quiet Life in the Country. The main reason why I really like this book is because Lady Hardcastle is an older heroine. So we don't have somebody who is super young. Instead, she is kind of, doesn't feel stodgy. That's not the right word, but she feels established. She's got an assistant or maid that travels with her. That is Flo. And they arrive out in the country and discover a body. And it feels a little bit like Closed Door because we had some traveling, like a troubadour actors. There were a certain amount of people that were in the vicinity around the time of this murder. Lady Hardcastle is a force to be reckoned with. She knows martial arts. She seems to have this background where you're like, were you, involved in espionage? She just really is a tough lady. And that's really the main reason why I would recommend this mystery. The mystery itself is fine, but for me, it is all about Lady Hardcastle. And then the next mystery that I would recommend to anyone, I have this omnibus version, which has 5 different Agatha Christie's in it. And the one that I want to recommend is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. This is a mystery that I think can be reread, but I do think that the first time is the most special. I'm not going to tell you anything about it. It's so much better if you go in blind. If you haven't read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, don't read anything about it. Just get it from the library and quietly pick it up and read it. We do have Hercule Poirot, which, love Miss Marple, but I think my heart belongs to Hercule. Anyway, it's a mystery that I think is phenomenal. I've had my husband read it so that we could talk about it. So if you haven't read Murder of Roger Ackroyd, then be sure to pick that up soon. Next, I have 2 nonfictions to read. The first one is As You Wish by Carrie Elwes. This is about the making of The Princess Bride. Carrie plays the role of Wesley, and you get the entire back end of what's going on during the making of Princess Bride. One of the reasons why I would feel comfortable recommending this to anyone is a lot of times memoirs can be gritty, in my opinion. You can have some really heavy content, you can have some language, you can have some adult content, and As You Wish is I think there's a tiny bit of language, but nothing that is extreme and, really off-putting. And if you like the Princess Bride movie, it really does give you this different perspective. And I think it's a pretty wholesome memoir as far as adult memoirs go. And I just loved it so much. I listened to it. You can listen to it and have him be the one to read it to you. And I love it. I think anybody could enjoy it. And then next, I have Braiding Sweetgrass. This is by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a collection of essays from a Native American perspective with nature and the environment and our created world being at the forefront of the themes. It is very thought-provoking. This is a book that I think is probably studied in a scholarly fashion. And I think anyone reading it should read it very slow. This should be kind of this like annotated, underlined, tabbed experience where you are really thinking about what it is that she's saying. She gives experiences of raising her girls, of her own childhood, of tribes and tribal experiences, as well as just botany and dendrology and all of that in the environment. The cover says Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a professor, and this very much does feel academic, but it also feels gentle and thought provoking. And I think it's a book that everyone should read. My last category is fantasy. I love the fantasy genre. I know there are a lot of people who don't appreciate it to the same level that I do, but I have two that I want to share that I think anyone would love to read. So the first one is really a big book, Mary Stewart's Merlin trilogy. So don't be intimidated by this. I actually last August thought, well, I'll just read the first one and see what I think. And I flew through this whole series. So the first one is called The Crystal Cave. If you only read one, that would be the one to choose. I think it's my favorite. This is the story of Merlin. And yes, it is the Merlin of King Arthur legend. We do end up meeting King Arthur and going along that whole storyline with him, with Guinevere and the Lady of the Lake, and with Excalibur, all of that. But this is Merlin's story, and I think Mary Stewart did such a, I would say, perfect job at blending classic literature with a bit of fantasy in it. So I recently did a video on if you've ever said that you don't like fantasy, then you should try these books. And I hemmed and hawed about whether to include this or not. I do think that this is such a chunker and such a commitment that it could feel a little bit intimidating to somebody who doesn't like fantasy. So if that's you, I would just say to give the Crystal Cave a try. There are audio versions out there. I listened to it and read the physical book sort of alternately, and it went really well for me. But it's lovely. It is a journey story, not only in traveling but also in a character arc and the development of Merlin. The Crystal Cave is really kind of his childhood, his youthhood. And then we have the Hollow Hills, which is kind of, his time when he's meeting Arthur, and Arthur is young and he's kind of working through that. And then the Last Enchantment is at the end of the story that we know. And then, of course, following along with Merlin towards the end of his life. I love this. If you haven't read Mary Stewart, she has such a broad types of books that she writes. Each one is so vastly different from another, but this one to me is her kind of core fantasy, and it's just an experience of a lifetime to read, I should say. Look at her on the back of this. Just so cute. Okay, the last one is a modern fantasy, and you might say, well, that's interesting because most of these books are all kind of vintage, more classic feeling, but I really loved this book, and so I want to encourage everyone to pick this up because I think it could be a book that everyone loves. So this is Agnes Auber's Mystical Cat Shelter by Heather Fawcett. This is her most recent adult fantasy fiction. In this, we have Agnes. She runs a cat shelter. So if you love cats, Heather very much understands cats. There is no lasting trauma. Sometimes in animal books, we can end up having traumatic events that are scarring. This is not that. This is a cozy, warm hug of a book. In this, we have Agnes, who runs cat shelter. I've said that already. And she needs a new cat shelter because there was a magician's duel out in the street outside of her current shelter, and it has destroyed part of the walls in her current cat shelter. So she is on the look for a new location. She ends up renting a spot It's in kind of a questionable part of town. And the neighbors, even in this questionable part of town, come to her and say, listen, there are magical artifacts being sold out of the basement of that house that you're in. There's also something kind of wonky with the oven. It seems to be a little bit enchanted. And we go from there. It is a lovely, wholesome story. There's a tiny bit of romance, but it is very small amount. And like I said, it's very wholesome. There is quite a bit of fantasy in this, in that, you've got to kind of settle into this idea of magicians dueling out in the street and magicians kind of having abilities that, your regular folk do not. But it is set in like a 1920s Montreal setting. So that feels very real, something we can all settle into because, that's something that we know. We do have Agnes grieving a little bit because she is a young widow. So there is that in there. She's got a wonderful sister and family situation. And she is just very resilient and persistent, and it's just a wonderful story. Like I said, the cats in this are so funny. Heather Fawcett has named each of the cats. We have one that does like really loud caterwauling, and she named it Ambulance. There are also a lot of other cat characters that are specifically named with specific quirky personalities. So there's my 10 books. I would love to know which ones you are specifically kind of attuned to or interested in. Let me know if you've read them already and like what you think, or if there are some that you're feeling like, yeah, I think that's something that I could pick up. I would love to know. And most importantly, I would love to know what you would put on a list of books that you think that you could feel comfortable recommending to anyone to read. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Until next time.